Earlier, I spoke to Yukon Huang. He is a senior fellow at the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I started by asking him whether Trump's accusation of China interfering in the U.S. midterm elections was in any way constructive.
No, I think it's quite misleading kind of statement because people have in their minds the kinds of interference, the accusations about Russia trying to influence the voter registrations or how people's perceptions are. What China's been basically doing is, you've been levying tariffs on us, we're levying tariffs on you. Tariffs have a negative impact on both sides. In the United States, tariffs on farm products basically hit the farming communities. This is not trying to manipulate the elections. This is basically what I would call the negative consequences of a tariff war. The real issue is no one wins in the tariff wars. We shouldn't be having this kind of a fight.
You know, there is a trend globally to have more unilateralism and less multilateralism, more of this nationalist agenda. China obviously has talked about that being something that's not good for the world. How do you see the turning point to which we come back to, perhaps, a more multilateral framework?
We have what I call a very ironic situation. A decade, 2 decades ago, when you talked about globalism, free trade, it was the US, Europe, the Western powers supporting this concept. Emerging market economies were more apprehensive. They weren't sure they would actually fare or do well under free trade because they were producing mostly agricultural products, raw materials. The West produced manufactured commodities, and the question was, can the emerging markets compete? Today, of course, the reverse is happening. Emerging market economies have done really well in terms of globalization and exporting manufactured goods, and this is now creating a backlash. So we have a change, what I call a changed global relationship, but not everyone accepted what this means and the implications. For example, in China, it's also unusual. Employment in services is increasing rapidly in China. Employment in manufacturing in China has actually been declining for 4 or 5 straight years in absolute numbers. So these are natural trends, they're structural trends, but people have to understand the nature, and they also have to prepare for it.
So I would ask you then, because China is essentially following the path of the United States in this regard, going through the pros and cons of globalization, what can Beijing learn from the experience of Americans and how to manage the expectations of the public?
Well, the first point we should realize is this focus on trade. Trade deficit, it's a wrong issue. Trade deficits per se are not bad. It doesn't correlate with growth. It doesn't correlate with jobs. People think it does. America's had a trade deficit for 40 straight years. It's really whether or not you're generating good jobs, your people are picking up the right skills, you're investing in the proper areas. That's the lesson for everybody.
But Americans are saying we don't have the same opportunities we used to have in certain sectors. And that could happen to other economies that follow this model. So what's the solution there?
And that question is a big question, a big challenge. The reality is that technology improvements, increasing reliance on robots has reduced the demand for labor in manufacturing. So worldwide, whether you're actually an emerging market economy or a US or Germany, the issue in the future will be, how do I prepare my people for services? Because that's where the jobs are going to come from. And how do you do that? It's really competitive education, infrastructure. You don't have much choice in this problem.
In your view, what's wrong in the U.S.-China relationship, can it be solved or addressed through tariffs, or do they just make the relationship more difficult?
First of all, let me use some descriptive words to describe what's happening. This trade war is counterproductive. Everybody loses, both sides, consumers, producers. It's unnecessary because there are better tools and policies to address the concerns. It's also in some ways illogical because this war is really not about trade. We call it a trade war. We use tariffs, but as I said, trade is not the problem. Deficit is not the problem. There is a legitimate concern, I think. I think it's a concern that both China and the United States need to focus on. And this is the question about whether or not China's rise has led to its using what the West calls unfair practices in acquiring technology. Now, from China's side, they do not see this as unfair. They see this as competitive development to become a more innovative economy. Much of the technology comes from the West. China, in fact, pays more for for patents,
Yeah.
the rights to use
Licensing.
intellectual property than practically any other country. Companies come into China. They form joint ventures. They bring new technology. That's the purpose of foreign direct investment. And we've always talked about that as being the desirable win-win from both sides. How do you get both sides back to realizing that there is actually potential gains to be from cooperating? And how do you address some of the concerns about how do you make the process smoother? And the question then is, there are modalities for doing this instead of tariffs. There's a bilateral investment treaty that's under negotiations for many years. That would address some of these concerns. The WTO has rules and regulations. Some of those rules and regulations don't cover these issues quite well. Thus, the real issue is how do you strengthen these regulations? How do you bring both sides to the table? Because these problems cannot be solved by a one-time tariff, a one-time action. It's going to need what I call institutional process, an arbitration process to work on these issues over years, not months.